Should fans be concerned about Logan Webb, whose velocity is down a little bit and the results haven't been so good recently? How much of a runway does Gabe Kapler have? How about Farhan Zaidi? You've got questions, we've got answers. Next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, it is another mailbag edition of the show. Before we jump into the questions, just two little things I wanted to mention. Giants signed Ken Giles to a minor league deal. This is a former best closer in the game, or at least in that tier of one of the elite arms in the game as recently as 2019. He's dealt with some injuries. He basically hasn't played since then. He's been hurt and ineffective, but they signed him to a minor league deal, and we very likely could see him in the last month of the year if they like what they see. And last we saw, he pitched in AAA yesterday. So I'm excited about Ken Giles. It's kind of a why not move given the Giants' current position and bullpen issues. And also Jacob Junis, who was hit in the hand by a line drive. Thankfully, it was the non-pitching hand. The x-rays were negative, but a MRI revealed a small fracture, but they think he's going to be able to push through it. So I just wanted to mention those two things because we hadn't yet, and they're kind of old news from earlier in the week. But the first question from our mailbag comes from John, who says, should we be worried about Logan Webb? Numbers are fine, but his stuff just isn't what it was in the postseason last year. And you're absolutely right. And this question came before yesterday's outing, which ultimately ended with Webb getting charged with 6 earned runs. I think none of them should have been earned. I've also made the case that earned runs versus unearned runs are kind of dumb and that they should all be earned because just because the inning would have ended there, you could have got the next guy out and he didn't. But regardless, it was another poor outing from a results standpoint for Logan Webb. And I talked yesterday about how his velocity is down, and I'm going to go into a little more detail now. I can see game by game what was his average sinker velocity. He doesn't throw a lot of four-seamers, so I'm primarily looking at the sinker. And last year, the trend was that, at its lowest, early in the season was when it was at its lowest, and it was around the lowest he averaged in any individual game last year was 91.8, and that was just a couple times. Later in the year, he had one start where he averaged 92, but as he got into late August and September, he was consistently 93, even almost 94, 93 and a half miles an hour. Whereas this season, he's just, at his peak, he was about 93, but he's consistently been lower. And starting in early August, he averaged 91 in a start, then he averaged 90.8, then 91, then back up to 91.7, and then in this last start, 91.5. So the velocity is undoubtedly down a little bit, and it is concerning. It's not just about velocity, but if you just simply look at the feedback you're getting, there's been a lot of contact lately. He's just kind of been unable to put guys away, and that's the result of just diminishing stuff, as you mentioned. So the fact that they keep running him out there, I'm assuming he feels fine and that he's not injured. Hopefully, I would really hope that he's not like concealing some kind of pain and that it leads to something worse. But I do have some concerns. The strikeout rate down from 26.5% last year to 19.9% this year. But overall, he's still been a very good pitcher. 3.33 ERA, fielding independent pitching is very similar. To me, he looks more like a number 2 or number 3 guy as opposed to a clear number 1 that he looked for the last many months of last season and then into October. So he is still just 25. This is a career high in innings for Webb. Last year was a career high at 148. So it could just be fatigue. although we haven't really seen that velocity that we saw for the last many months of last year, really at any point with any consistency this year. And that to me is a little bit concerning, but as long as he's healthy and there isn't some kind of serious underlying issue, then it's still been the fact that this is like a worrying season for Webb, even though he's still been really good, is a good sign. But maybe an indicator that they still need to go out and bring back a Carlos Rodón or bring in a Jacob deGrom or someone like that on a short-term deal, just some kind of frontline arm so that it takes a little bit of pressure off of Webb. And then, of course, Kyle Harrison will eventually, hopefully, be coming up and being maybe an impact starter in that rotation as well. So overall, the future of the starting rotation still could be really strong, even if Webb is not quite as good as he looked in the last many months of last season. So coming up next, we're going to talk about how much runway Gabe Kapler and or Farhan Zaidi have. Like, how much space do they have to work with before they go on the hot seat? So all of that in just a second. But first, you're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think of calling for a ride. But no, you live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. All right, as promised, how much runway does Gabe Kapler and or Farhan Zaidi have? The next question comes from Sam, who says, is there a chance Kapler is gone after this season? Sam also says, what minor leaguers do you want to see get called up? I'm not sure I'm going to answer that one simply because I didn't prepare for it. I didn't see the second part as I was planning this out. But how is there a chance Kapler is gone after this season? There's always a chance. Like, things like this can come out of nowhere. And in fact, many of the manager firings we've seen this year have come somewhat out of nowhere. And you might have thought certain guys were safe and they weren't. But for Kapler, I really do believe that Zaidi values continuity, and they're not just going to make impulsive decisions to fire somebody based on this year not quite going as hoped. And also, it would be foolish to think, if you're Farhan Zaidi and you're like, Gabe Kapler is the problem with this roster. I think that's wrong. I've said over and over how if we're looking to hand out blame for how this season has gone, I think the arrows point straight to the front office. I think Kapler has pretty much done all he could do with the roster that he had. Maybe you think there's some suboptimal decisions, but that's not keeping them from being a team that's going to win 95 games and a team that is more around 500. I don't think that it works that way. It's more like the players that they have just didn't perform, and the injuries to Crawford and Belt and Longoria and many guys just not performing all that well, Wade, Yastrzemski, and on and on. And so, yeah, I just don't, if they just go, yeah, it's Kapler's fault and fire him, to me, that shows pretty poor judgment on their part. So I don't think that this is going to happen. And you look at like Dave Roberts in Los Angeles. Yes, the Dodgers win year in and year out, but Zaidi and Friedman hired Dave Roberts way back in the day when Don Mattingly left, and they never have fired him, even though there have been fans and media sometimes who have called for his firing based on decisions in October. They, I think, just really don't believe in this manager carousel, and I don't think they should either. We've seen time and time again, like Kapler was fired in Philadelphia, and then Joe Girardi comes in, and everyone's like, yes, this is the solution, finally. And then they had multiple seasons where they were the same team. And so that would be the same type of mistake, in my opinion. But the next question from Fitch, who says, what kind of runway does Farhan and company have at this point? we're heading into year 5, and while it hasn't been a failure, it feels like the Giants are a long ways from relevance. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, the arrows point more to the front office, but I do believe they have significant runway left. There's just, to me, like zero shot that they're just going to fire Farhan Zaidi after this season. But I don't think they're thrilled with how this season has gone, certainly, because, I mean, it just hasn't gone well. But here's the thing. When we say it feels like they're a long ways from relevance, people were saying that prior to last season as well, and then they went out and they won 107 games. I always get people saying, you can't just focus on last year. I'm not focusing on last year. I'm telling the history of the last few years under Zaidi. The fact that, I mean, you can't say this year matters, but last year doesn't matter. Last year mattered, this year matters. They both count. So we'll talk about this year, but we'll also talk about last year. And so I think that like so much has gone wrong this year and they're around 500. And so if some things had gone better, you can easily pick up 10 wins and be very much in the thick of the playoff race. They're only, I think, 5.5 back still. So even like 5 more wins and they're right there. And so, and plus we still have a month plus of the season to play out. So assuming they don't make the playoffs, assuming they finish around 500, then I think that it's an important offseason for this front office, and that if they just do more of the same and next year is more of the same, and I really do believe that if next year is another disappointing year like this one, the questions get a little bit louder, but I believe they have a lot of faith and trust in Farhan Zaidi and his front office, and I still do too, for what it's worth, even though this season I think they did kind of blunder. I gave them a C- for the offseason grade. I thought that they didn't do enough on the position player side. And we keep talking about how the offense has been fine, but lately they haven't been fine. And when I say offense, I just literally mean run scoring compared to, and like weighted runs created plus, but I'm not saying position players, because even though they've done okay in that regard, but not so much lately, they're really scuffling offensively for the last month or so. But even some players who have been somewhat valuable offensively, like for example, Jock Peterson, despite his streakiness, he's not a good defender or a good base runner. So overall, it's just a weak position player group. And I've said this a lot, like their best position player has put up like 2 Fangraphs wins above replacement, which just isn't very good. You've got players at this point in the season, the best players in the league are up around 6+. So that the Giants just don't have any guys like that, and that's a problem. And there were stars out there in free agency, and they just didn't get any of them. And they don't have minor leaguers coming up and making that kind of real impact either. And Zaidi admitted earlier this week in a podcast with Tim Kawakami that their best prospects are probably not going to make an impact next year either. And so they're going to need to be more aggressive this offseason in order to have a better group of players that will have a better season than they had this year. And there's a lot of guys who are reaching free agency. So this is a big offseason. So the question is, how much runway do they have? And I would say at least another full season of runway. But if next season goes poorly, you start to kind of wonder things a little bit louder. And again, though, I think organization-wide, they value continuity, right? Look at the old front office and how they were just there forever. I don't think they like to just shake things up as a reaction to a season or two, when ultimately deep down they believe in what you're doing. And I don't think they would have hired him if they didn't believe in the direction he sold them on during the interview process. So anyway, coming up in just a minute, how far would I go to land Aaron Judge? Age is a concern, but hey, this team could use some superstars. So all of that in just a second. But first, all right, as promised, more questions and answers. Next one comes from Adrian, who says, how far would you go to land Aaron Judge? Age is a concern, but I would love to see a superstar like him on the Giants. What would be some other realistic free agent signings? So I mentioned how Zaidi had this podcast interview with Tim Kawakami of The Athletic, and he talked about how he basically said it's important for us to establish 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 everyday guys who are going to be out there every day, and that the platooning is best when it kind of fills out the remainder of your roster, but you've got that core of 2 to 5. I mean, 2 I think is too few, but let's call it 3 or 4 realistically, and 5 would be great. 2 is maybe too few. Everyday guys who are like, if you look at the Dodgers, you've got your Betts, Turner, and Freeman. There you go. And the Giants, they had that, and that's what gets missed often. They had that in 2021 with Posey and Crawford and Belt and Bryant once he came here, and Longoria when he was healthy. They had some guys who are not platoon guys, but this year it's just like the whole roster is platooning because the guys who are supposed to be everyday guys, Crawford, Belt, Longoria, they just haven't been healthy enough or productive enough to be on the field every day. So anyway, when we look at, okay, how do you establish 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 everyday guys? And you admitted that their farm system isn't producing this top talent probably next year, but the year after that, hopefully. I mean, hopefully it's next year, but probably not, because it's more in the lower levels of the minors still, like Luciano and Matos and others. But how do you do it? You have to do it either through trades or free agency. And so when you mention Judge, he's the cream of the crop of this free agent class. So I have said this time and time again, I have my hesitations about Aaron Judge because of the age. He's going to be 31 or 32 for next year. I think he's going to be 31 next season. He turns 31 in April. And so if you sign him to a whatever term deal, 5-year deal, he'll be 35 at the end. 6-year deal, he'll be playing his age 36 season at the end. 7-year deal, which is probably ultimately what he's going to get, he'll be 37 at the end. So you're paying big money, and just think about those age 35, 36, 37 seasons. I've compared him, not that he's a similar player, but Evan Longoria was like a great player when he was in his late 20s, early 30s, and then started to decline a little bit. The Giants picked him up, and we've seen the result. We've seen like just getting the tail end of a good player's career. They're just not the same. And Aaron Judge is 6'7", 282, according to Fangraphs. I don't know how up-to-date that weight is, but I just worry about injuries. I worry about aging. And so I'm not going to sit here and say they should just do whatever it takes to get Aaron Judge, give him 7 years, $330 million. I'm not going to say that. I think it still has to make sense for you, and it has to not become this giant albatross quickly. But at the same time, I would kind of try to sign him. I would really seriously entertain bringing in Aaron Judge, because he checks a lot of boxes for you. He's the face of the franchise type of guy. He's a star talent. Like, the production on the field when he's healthy is elite. Dude's going to hit probably 60 home runs this year. And he's been the best player in baseball this season. And he's hitting free agency. And he is local. And so there's a very real possibility that he's one of these rare kind of superstar bats who wouldn't mind coming to play in San Francisco, where it's tough to hit. And I mean, for him, he could worry about home run records and Hall of Fame and stuff like that. If you play in a worse ballpark, Yankee Stadium is very favorable for hitting all these homers. So I would definitely be involved. But the fact that he's 30 and he's not like 26, if he's 26, it's a whole different conversation. But yeah, I would hope that they're seriously involved. And me personally, I would possibly just stick my neck out and try to get it done. And in terms of other realistic free agent signings, I kind of made a quick list. Brandon Nimmo is someone I keep talking about. Outfielder, left-handed bat, really good on-base percentage guy, really good selectivity at the plate. Has been a decent defender as far as I know, and doesn't have huge platoon splits, so he could very much be an everyday guy for you. Mitch Haniger is an interesting guy, a little bit older. I think he's 32 already, but local guy as well. And a couple years ago, hit 39 home runs. Last year, actually, 2021, hit 39 home runs. Has been a really quality player, has had some fluke injuries, but an interesting name to watch. Not at the top tier of the market, but kind of mid-tier, but still good. Mid-tier, like, of good. You know what I'm saying? Like, just a good player, not a great player. You've got Trey Turner out there. If you want to get faster and more athletic, there you go. So he's probably going to get a huge contract as well, but I would hope the Giants would be involved. From what I've heard, he wants to play on the East Coast, but oftentimes those rumors end up not being true. Carlos Correa is likely to opt out. You said realistic. I'm not sure how realistic these really are, except if you really feel like you want everyday players next year and you don't have them currently and you don't have them coming up through your minor league system, you got to sign them or trade for them. So that's why I'm calling these guys realistic. And they have like not a blank slate, but close to a blank slate in terms of their 2023 payroll. It's not blank. I mean, if Carlos Rodón opts out, which is almost a certainty, they'll have like $69 million committed for next year, which is almost $100 million short of where they've consistently hung out from a payroll perspective. And so you could sign these guys. It's not like these are prohibitively expensive. There's room to add them to your payroll. There's no doubt, even with the Giants' pattern of spending. It's just a matter of what they end up doing. There was room last year to do these types of moves, and they didn't do it. They kind of used that money to bring back guys and then fill out a rotation. But next year, their rotation is pretty much filled out already with Webb, Cobb, Wood, DeSclafani, and Junis all under contract for next year. And so, to me, that it's more in play than ever that they will actually make some significant free agent position player additions. So Arenado has an opt-out, and he would be an everyday guy and a good third baseman if you move on from Evan Longoria. Xander Bogaerts, Dansby Swanson, Josh Bell, Jose Abreu. Those are just a few names, and that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast, Locked On MLB, on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance, and thank you to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.